Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the AI for Good Global Summit. My name is Bastiaan Kwast from the International Telecommunication Union, and I have the privilege of introducing today's session, AI to prevent modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced and child labor. I'm joining today from Geneva, Switzerland. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and the organizer of the AI for Good Global Summit. In partnership with 38 sister United Nations agencies, ACM, and co-convened with Switzerland. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our facilitator, Alice. Hi, Alice, how are you?
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much to ITU and to the AI for Good Global Summit for hosting today's conversation, and warm greetings and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. I am Alice Eckstein, Program Manager for the Modern Slavery Program and Project Manager for Delta 8.7. Our institutional home is the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, a global think tank within the UN system made up of 13 institutes and programs headquartered in Tokyo. The Modern Slavery Program was developed as a global knowledge resource for the anti-slavery community, with an emphasis on connecting anti-slavery research to policymakers and policy implementers. Many of you have heard Target 8.7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals cited. This target calls for all UN member states to, quote, take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. You may have heard that over 40 million people around the world today are considered to be living in these conditions of exploitation. But what remains less defined is what are the effective measures that the target requires countries to take. That is how Delta 8.7 came about. It was formed in 2017, supported by the UK Home Office's Modern Slavery Innovation Fund. It is the global knowledge platform for the Alliance 8.7, which accelerates efforts to achieve Target 8.7. Through our networks, we convene research and data to promote evidence-based policy solutions and identify those effective measures. But data can be difficult to collect, and not just data about prevalence of these human rights abuses, but also about larger vulnerabilities to and patterns of exploitation. Policymakers, frontline responders, and researchers all bring their own experience, knowledge, and data or research needs to their work to combat modern slavery. 2 years ago, February 2019, Delta 8.7 convened the first Code 8.7 meeting. Over 2 days, a variety of experts came together at United Nations headquarters in New York City to discuss how AI, computational science, and machine learning tools were being used in the fight against modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced and child labor, and how they could be mobilized further. The Code 8.7 Organizing Committee emerged from these conversations and has developed collaborative projects and a shared research agenda in the past 18 months. In today's panel, we'll be discussing some of this work. And I couldn't be more delighted to introduce the panelists from the Code 8.7 Organizing Committee, all who are researchers themselves and who will be discussing some of the challenges and opportunities presented by the use of AI to achieve Target 8.7. They are Nadia Bliss, Executive Director of the Global Security Initiative at Arizona State University. She also currently serves as the Executive Committee member of the Computing Community Consortium, which is a US-based convener of industry, government, and academia to advance research solutions for national and global challenges. Anjali Mazumdar is the theme lead on AI and justice and human rights at the Alan Turing Institute based in the UK. Her work focuses on co-designing and developing responsible and inclusive data and AI methods, tools, and frameworks for safeguarding people, especially vulnerable people, from harm. She also serves on the senior management board of the UK's Policy and Evidence Centre for Modern Slavery and Human Rights. James Goulding directs the NLab, a centre targeting analytics for social good at Nottingham University's Business School. He also leads analytics streams at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. Doreen Boyd is Associate Director at the Rights Lab, where she leads the Data and Measurement Program. The principal focus of her work is understanding how geospatial and novel data streams can assist in anti-slavery efforts. Today, our panelists will each speak about challenges and ethical considerations in this work, as well as some very promising directions forward in employing new technologies to combat some of the world's entrenched abuses of human rights. We know all of you in the audience will have your own questions to contribute, so we're going to leave plenty of time for discussion. Please use the Q&A feature in this webinar to send in your questions throughout the presentations to come. And now I'll turn to our first panelist, Nadia Bliss. Nadia, please share with us your perspective on the research challenges we have before us.
Good morning here in Phoenix, Arizona. Good day and good evening in other parts of the world. Alice, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I would love to thank our hosts, AI for Good, and it is an absolute privilege to be here with my distinguished panelists. I'll say a little bit about my background, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that we have specifically as part of the Computing Community Consortium. So I'm a computer scientist by training. I have been working in specifically national security research and development my entire career, which is close to the last almost 2 decades. I am at Arizona State University, so I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona, and here I run the Global Security Initiative, which is our university's sort of focal point for national and global security research. So from my perspective, it is impossible to have national security without having global security. And I think human security is a global security and a national security issue. So I think this is an incredibly relevant and incredibly important topic. And I appreciate, particularly as a computer scientist, being engaged in this conversation. One of my other roles is that I serve on the Computing Community Consortium. Computing Community Consortium is an organization that brings together about 20 or so computer scientists here in the United States. And we catalyze the computing community, the entire computing community, to think about the future of computer science. What are the big challenges? What are the big opportunities? What are some of the big things that we need to be anticipating in the next 10 years, 20 years, and even beyond? Specifically, we think about computer science research and how does computer science and computing research can address those global and national challenges. So one of the products of the Computing Community Consortium about a couple years ago was a 20-year artificial intelligence roadmap. And over the last couple years, as Alice mentioned, we have also brought together, came together with the efforts from Code 8.7 to bring the community around the problems specifically on how do we apply emerging AI technology to combat and mitigate challenges around modern slavery and human trafficking. So now about a year ago, we brought everybody together in the community. So we had about 50 researchers representing both the computing research community, which is much broader than just computer science, and folks from organizations, practitioners, survivors, in a workshop to talk about how can we take some of these AI technologies and apply in context of these incredibly challenging problems. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight is we're in the midst of finalizing our workshop report with the steering committee. So the report will be available, but as a preview in this particular conversation, I want to highlight a couple of key recommendations and observations that we as a community, so it was important to bring out into a research roadmap type of product. So first of all, we identified 4 specific areas where we essentially see these are critical areas where we can apply AI in context of modern slavery and human trafficking problems. So the first one is networks. How do we identify hidden populations targeted for exploitation? And especially, can we identify ways to detect those populations early before they're particularly vulnerable? Another area is perceptive agents. So essentially be able to provide survivor support and identify tipping points where interventions make a difference. So this is an interesting, there's clearly interplay between this notion of networks. How do a bunch of different, whether they're financial networks, social networks, any other kind of networks, how do those interplay with those tipping points? The other thing that we identified is a common framework for data standards to allow to be able to bring in these complex data sets, and also be able to make sure that we're incredibly responsible with the techniques around privacy and security around those data sets. Again, we're thinking about incredibly potentially vulnerable populations, and those privacy and security issues are vital in those considerations. And then the fourth one is data fusion and surveying. So can we think about ethics-infused AI techniques to integrate and process, make sense of diverse and heterogeneous data? So there's a lot of technical challenges associated with this particular area. One is, for example, sometimes the data sets are not available. We often talk about big data, but there's also small data. There may be missing data. People, especially if they're vulnerable, may not want to share too much information. So those are the big 4 points. So again, just to iterate those: networks, perceptive agents, a common framework, and data fusion and surveying. So that report will be coming out, and as soon as it's available, we would be happy to share the links with everyone. So the other couple things I wanted to mention, especially as someone who's worked in computer science for my entire career, we're observing an interesting tipping point at the moment. We essentially have, between the scale of data sets that are available and the fact that our computer architectures have allowed us to process significant amount of the data rather efficiently, we're essentially at a point where a lot of industries, federal agencies, academic institutions, nonprofit organizations are starting to adopt AI. So we're at this interesting point in adoption where AI is going from something that is highly specialized to something that is really being used by different application domains. And as we move into this environment of adoption of artificial intelligence technology, it is very important to think about the fact that it is not necessarily a solution for everything. And when the AI technology is being adopted, particularly in a sensitive domain context such as modern slavery or human trafficking, it is incredibly important to consider the domain implications and bring in that domain expertise into the conversation. So as such, that's one of the other things that I wanted to point out here. As part of the CCC, we also just recently released a number of white papers in terms of thinking about the next 4 years or so. And one of the topic areas we outlined is the importance of bringing in this notion of critical inquiry, humanities, social science, and domain expertise into the adoption and development of AI technologies. So how do we make sure and create structures that people can exchange information effectively, and that we develop artificial intelligence technology in context of appropriate ethical and democratic frameworks? The other thing I'd like to point out is, as we think through these novel AI technologies, it is really important to consider that these technologies are being adopted in context of used by humans. So as they're being developed, this notion of human artificial intelligence teaming is another really important challenge area, and also an opportunity area. So when we think about the development of new AI technology, it is vital to consider how that technology is being used, and often that use often changes over the course of the technology's time. And depending on the expertise of the person in the field using artificial intelligence technology, there may need to be different trainings that are developed, curriculum developed, sort of this notion of AI literacy through the entire pipeline. And then finally, the last point that I want to make before I hand it back over to Alice is the importance of having diverse participation. So we talk about this notion of bringing in domain expertise into artificial intelligence. I think it's also really important to bring in expertise from disciplines outside of computer science into development of artificial intelligence technologies. And then I also think this notion of lived experience is vital in development of artificial intelligence technologies, because as we think about the way a lot of the technology has been developed, often it's been developed with a very homogeneous segment of the population, and especially as they're being adopted in context of support of vulnerable population, that lived experience is absolutely vital to bring in. And with that, I will pause and hand it over to Alice.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Anjali Mazumdar was at the CCC conference herself and works extensively on responsible and inclusive AI and data tools. Anjali, can I ask you to describe some of the issues you work with at the Turing Institute that are related to these research challenges?
Certainly, and thank you, Alice. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be with my fellow panelists. And Nadia really helped to set the stage, so I'll try to take things one step further, maybe with a couple of examples of the type of work that we're doing. If I could ask Jinu to share the slides, that would be great. Thank you. So when we're talking about AI, I think we also want some clarity there about, we're often talking about statistical methods, machine learning methods, not robots, at least not at this point, that are taking over the world in any way. But on a serious note, of course, in the broad definition of AI, it involves both opportunities and risks, as Nadia sort of highlighted for us. So often when you see the words AI and human rights, I am faced with questions about concerns around privacy and discrimination, all of which are valid, but we've also recognized that AI and its related data-driven technologies have the potential to make really critical step changes to tackle some of society's greatest humanitarian challenges, including inequities and modern slavery. So just next slide, please. So in a world where we're also trying to envision a world that's more safe, fair, just, and inclusive for all, and as an institute and the colleagues around me who are in the data science and AI field, often we're looking at these new forms of data and data flows or algorithms that can really help to tackle some of these challenges. So if we take sort of a broader look at humanitarian, the state of the world, is that we're seeing that there's a growing need, with the number of displaced, marginalized, and vulnerable people being higher than it ever was before. So there's nearly 1% of humanity is estimated to be displaced in the world, leaving over a billion people without legal identity. And it's been estimated that over 40 million people are in modern day slavery. Some of these estimates are probably also underestimates, where some of these are often very hidden populations and difficult to estimate. So in the context again of modern slavery, it's a complex definition. It often includes multiple typologies. There's different legal definitions, of which I won't bog us down into at the moment. But if we break it down to some of these different typologies, we're also looking at the displacement in terms of, or the differential in terms of women, with nearly half of human trafficking victims being women and 35% of women globally experiencing physical and sexual violence. So it's often these more vulnerable people that are in an exploited situation. So in trying to tackle some of these greatest challenges, we also need to consider how we can harness this data in a way that respects privacy, concern around further discrimination. Often these terms are centered around data justice. So the questions that we are tackling with are, how do we create these systems that work well for a diverse range of users, including researchers, our policymakers, our frontline agencies? And in doing so, what populations are included in some of these data sets, and how well do they represent the populations that the system will interact with? Recognizing that sometimes historical data set represent values that may not be consistent with what they are in present day. So that's including sort of situations of historical discrimination. Nadia also raised the issues around limited access to data. And that's not only for us as researchers that are trying to enable policymakers and frontline agencies to improve their services, but also in the data that's being captured and the limitations of these, particularly in administrative data, which ends up being, in the case of modern slavery and other humanitarian challenges, is patchy and sparse. So again, we're getting back to the situation of how do we identify the data privacy and security concerns around these AI innovations, and how do we ensure that there isn't mission creep or inequality concerns while actually trying to tackle these grand challenges. So next slide, please. So the adoption of sustainable goals has really encouraged the quantification of complex social issues, which are challenging to address, one of them being modern slavery. And one of the priorities for us and why modern slavery is so important is also that no country, no business, or even an individual is unscathed. It touches each of us. And so, next slide, please. So this is just, it doesn't even capture sort of the breadth of the challenges within the modern slavery space, but as just a brief sort of highlight, these are some of the areas that we're working on. And it really tries to touch on the complex nature of modern slavery that has been posed, and recognizing that new technologies such as remote sensors and machine learning methods, which my colleagues at Nottingham will probably speak about, can yield new solutions to enable law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and our frontline NGOs to engage with researchers and help to really disrupt the situation and ideally prevent modern slavery and reduce the risk to victims. Next slide, please. So over the last 2 decades, many cases of slavery are at sea and have been reported by the media. And the global estimates often don't capture this. And so one of the pieces of work that we've embarked on is really how can we tackle and understand the challenges of disrupting what's happening at the sea with respect to labor abuse. Next slide. So we've been tasked with various questions from our stakeholders, which is around a higher level sort of policy question, which are things like, what is the scale of the problem? Because there's a need to measure it. Are things improving? And the more operational questions is how do we disrupt it? And that's where my colleagues at Nottingham will speak about some of their work, which is really on how to use remote sensing technologies that might be available, whether that's satellite imagery or the remote sensors that are on vessels. And how do we then incorporate that with other administrative data? So these are sort of, how do we bring together the complex different data sources, which might have spatial, geographical, temporal elements to it? These pose both technical questions, legal questions, ethical questions that we have to ponder. Next slide, please. So another area is actually left with the financial side of things. So modern slavery is often an exploitation of people for money, and the financial services industry can be a conduit for criminal activity. So one potential is to work with financial transaction data and working with our financial institutions, because profits from slavery can be laundered through legitimate financial institutions. And the traffickers might often open personal and business accounts to handle these proceeds. Whilst often there's cash-based, financial services dealing with cash are also exposed to these high risk, including money services and cash card companies. And these monies are being moved through intricate networks and using financial systems to move these proceeds both within and across countries. Next slide, please. So we've embarked on a piece of work that's looking at how we can use network analysis and anomaly detection to try and understand sort of how money is being moved and what those patterns and behaviors are. But of course, the challenge is that this needs to be understood between often law enforcement and financial institutions, or between financial institutions. And this turns into a challenge around data flows. So how do we tackle this? And this is both, there's efforts that we can do as researchers that might involve certain types of privacy enhancing technologies around synthetic data. But when we're doing this in practice, we now need to consider a different type of ecosystem, both in which the data can flow, but within also that the actual AI intervention can be harnessed. And that might involve a different type of privacy enhancing technology, such as multi-party computation. Next. So just as a way to demonstrate one way that we're trying to take a look at a more responsible approach to this as well is looking at sexual exploitation online. Next, please. So this simply demonstrates how we bring together a multi-sector and multidisciplinary group. This involves bringing together domain experts, legal experts, ethics, and the technical expertise, as well as involvement right across the different sectors. And the domain experts engage with sex workers and survivors. And we have a series of questions that are not only about the technical side, but trying to address the ethical and the human rights considerations, and also the sustainability of these systems over time, because there are certain risks that come over time. Next, and I will just try to wrap up here. So finally, this is really one of the largest challenges that we found, is that it's reliant on how we can really best enable data flows across sectors. So next slide, and I'll wrap it up here, this is just demonstrating that there's lots of challenges with small patchy data sets sitting in different organizations that need to be brought together. And we are looking at how we might do this, which data sets could be made open, which ones are proprietary and sensitive, and what are the potential machine learning AI methods that could help to support enabling those data flows and harnessing those data systems. And I will leave things here and pass it back to Alice.
Thanks so much, Anjali. That was really a fantastic introduction to the wealth of data and information that Turing and you grapple with in your work. Now, I'm seeing some questions coming through the Q&A, and that's fantastic. Please keep them coming. A couple of audience members have asked about some of the practical use cases. So this is the perfect time to turn to our next two speakers, both of whom are from the University of Nottingham. First, James Goulding, who has some use cases to discuss, including the use of AI to map vulnerability and understand the drivers of modern slavery. So let me pass it over to you, James.
Okay, yeah, some really good questions already. I'm going to now try and gamble and share my screen. So if you just bear with me a second. Okay, if someone could confirm that is visible, that would be great. Right, no one. Thank you, Dorian. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few examples of applying AI to the sort of context we're talking about. I think Anjali's made some really good points already. One, we tend not to call it AI. I mean, it is artificial intelligence methods, but we would tend to call it machine learning in the field itself. And part of that is because we don't want to make people think that what we're creating are robots. We don't want to confuse it with like digital technologies. These are statistical and analytical methods that are kind of there to shed light either on the vulnerability people have to these like pernicious crimes or perpetrators of them. So I'm going to talk about that and some examples. I think another key thing is like it really does split what we look at. And Anjali said there's an estimate of 40 million people currently enslaved across the world, and that, you know, to meet the SDG target of eradicating that by 2030 means, I think we're aiming to free 15,000 people a day, which is an incredible task. But that doesn't even account for preventing other people entering into those conditions, and that's something I just wanted to essentially to focus on in my examples. In the UK, the government response was to create, essentially to modern slavery, was to set out these 4 Ps: pursue, prevent, protect, and prepare. And I think Anjali's already mentioned working with banks to try and identify anomalous behaviour, and that would be part of pursue. But I think AI's role and one of the impacts it can make, very much in a privacy preserving fashion, working with survivors, is in the protect stage. So things I'm going to talk about very much are kind of from that protect angle. So, I mean, you don't have many talks about slavery, I guess, with insects in them, but I wanted to mention this too, because again, I think Nadia mentioned the importance of crossover with disciplines. And this is something I came across. This fly, unless you don't know, is an Aedes aegypti mosquito, which now terrifies me because of a project we did on dengue fever. And what I learned from working with epidemiologists is something that's called the epidemiological triad. So diseases only exist and profligate because of this combination. There is a host, someone who has the disease. For dengue fever, often that's children who suffer the most from it. There's an agent, and it's this mosquito, which is it now terrifies me every time I see an insect with black and white legs. I think it's one of these mosquitoes, so run. But also, very importantly, maybe under-examined, it is the environment. So this mosquito survives in areas of low-lying water that's polluted. So like the picture I've shown at the bottom here. And that's a sort of approach to analysing these problems, which we're trying to move across, I guess, to slavery, to create a slavery triad to attack these problems. So there is an agent. These are the gangmasters and the people perpetrating the crimes. There are hosts, where can be a numerous number of people. But key to this is the environment that exist, the low-lying water, as it were, that allow essentially enslaved people to enter into that condition. And so very much I think that AI can have a role in addressing and identifying those aspects, which are very hard to find, because unlike dengue fever, slavery is hidden. Dengue fever is very visible. It's a terrible problem, but you can see it. So there's a huge amount of data points. There's a huge amount of scientific research on it. But aspects like slavery, much harder to see, obviously, by definition hidden. So less data points are very much harder to unearth. So I noticed one of the questions about vulnerable communities, how you find those. This is key to the sort of problems that I think AI can help address. So very different from Terminators and digital tools, but just taking complex messy, sparse data sets and finding the patterns in them that can then provide explanations which can inform interventions. So a key part of that is, there's a lack of information about this problem. I mean, this is something that is well known, affecting all SDGs. It's been called a statistical tragedy, especially in Africa. And the target of the examples I'm going to show you are really about using machine learning to assess and understand that problem space, to better understand the environments that are high risk, the characteristics of vulnerable individuals, but also, obviously there's qualitative work examining these aspects as work with survivors that inform all these models, but it's very hard to do such rich analysis. To do this at scale is an area that AI can help with. So the projects that we've kind of been looking at that would be very interesting to discuss are to take sparse, very expensive, very hard fought ground truths about vulnerability, either in individuals or areas, which are very precious resources, but use those in combination with other features that we can extract, which aren't necessarily taken from expensive surveys, but from the data sets that exist. Maybe they're stored in companies, maybe they're sitting within governments, in silos all over the world, but aren't being used. Maybe they're being used for profit, but they're certainly not being used for the sort of social problems that we could be leveraging them for. So things like mobile phone data sets, or activity in cell towers, or transport data, or increasingly something Dorian will talk about, drone imagery and satellite imagery and demographics and so on, and use those data sets and see whether we can find proxies in them that reflect the vulnerability we see in our valuable ground truths. And the way we find that relationship is using AI. So machine learning methods to find those complex nonlinear relationships. If we can do that, and that's what we're exploring as part of the research, then we can generate potentially risk models, which can be applied to areas we haven't been to, but still have these proxy data sets. And it can emphasize vulnerability, predict where vulnerability is happening, but also importantly, AI is not just about prediction, it's about unpacking explanations that might not be apparent to us at scale, and then working with innovation. The reason that's possible is, while many of these areas where slavery is particularly prevalent or infrastructurally poor, they are data rich, often surprisingly so. So when I first went to Africa, I was amazed by the proliferation of mobile phone and cell data, because of lack of a traditional landline infrastructure, but also the use of things like mobile money. So like in Tanzania and Uganda, about 20% of GDP flows through these data systems, and they're stored, and they can be used in an anonymized and protected fashion to try and unpick areas of vulnerability. And finally, obviously, drone imagery and satellite imagery. So are we just going to quickly talk in the last few minutes of this introduction about a few examples of projects we have running at NLab and in Nottingham with the Rights Lab, and also in collaboration with other people on Code 8.7 like Anjali, that work at different levels. So whether it's looking at a city level vulnerability or across a whole country, or maybe the differences between nations themselves, and how AI can help there. So I'll start off with just the top three, and I'm going to run through them very quickly, and then maybe there's more questions to be had later. So the first example is some work I do with Madeline Ellis and other people in Nottingham, who's looking at Tanzania, and specifically the city of Dar es Salaam, which has doubled in size in the last 10 years. Huge amount of infrastructural problems, 70% slums. There is almost no information about demographics in the city, yet it's an increasing problem is urban slavery. But what we can do is look at the data sets that exist there from, say, this is an example of cell tower data sets. So we're not looking at individuals at all, but just activity in an area which might have thousands of people in, to understand things just like the amount of SMS being fired through the cell tower that gives them an insight to overcrowding and certain types of demographics. And you can see patterns of communities that exist in this data and use AI to model those patterns. Now, if you take these different features that you can find in these proxy data sets, from retail coverage, from affluence levels, from overcrowding and density, they give you indications of vulnerability that then the AI can find patterns between ground truths. In this case, it was ground truths that were painfully implemented, right? A wide scale survey we did with the World Bank on the ground, but that allowed us to connect risk of slavery in areas to these other data sets via AI that can then be projected out into other cities. And that means we can see very interesting patterns. So things like, which surprised me, areas with increased use of mobile money are less vulnerable to slavery, domestic slavery and forced labor. And that kind of connects with the idea that financial independence can act very much as a protection against enslavement. But things like areas where pay was relatively high connecting to slavery surprised me. I would have thought it would have been just in areas with high poverty. But these non-linear methods are showing, well, there's masking effects here. People are attracted to those areas because of high pay and jobs and opportunities. And that is when they fall into essentially the trap of slavery. And that was emphasized again when you use the kind of convolutional networks and AI technology to say, well, where exactly is this happening? And you see it's in areas next to industrial land. So they have high overcrowding, high density, and you can physically see that. So this is an area of Dar es Salaam where there is high risk, and the AI model emerged these examples for us of where we have an industrial section with job opportunities, and people come to areas essentially in slums nearby, and that is where they are most vulnerable and resources should be applied. So as I said, this is work with the World Bank that's ongoing. Another example that I'm going to spin through really quickly is in Brazil, where we use similar data sets, but not this time where slavery is happening, but where people originated from when they recovered from being enslaved. And so what were the features of the areas where they entered into slavery? And for this, we get our ground truths are again key. The labels that we use for AI, and this is where Smart Lab, an incredible initiative that has mapped Brazil and logged where areas of slavery are occurring, can feed into the AI models that we have. And so from that, we categorize 3,600 municipalities across the country with slavery risk from those ground truths, and then use the AI models with these proxy data sets again to try and understand exactly what it is that's meaning people in certain areas are ending up in slavery. And we were really surprised as soon as we started creating this ongoing work, we were getting high accuracy rates. So the proxy data sets can give you good indications. And the features that are coming up, again, this is what AI is good at, not just predictions and digital technology in the field, but unpacking explanatory AI, explaining which of our 100 variables is doing the heavy lifting. And it's not census data, but it's these neo-demographics, these fine-grained information about credit ratings and mobile phone usage that really reflect isolation and vulnerability. And also down here, one that was very interesting, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is mobility measures. So when people are essentially trapped in certain areas, that is a very distinct indicator of increased vulnerability to entering into slavery. The important thing from that is that the models again are not the end; they're just a tool. So we're now working with people in Brazil to say, okay, when the model gets it wrong, do we need to go and survey more, or potentially have we highlighted areas where we need to get more variables? So they are just a tool in the chain. And finally, my final slide, you can use this on the national scale. And this was something that was very interesting. So very small data, 70 data points, and new tools in AI are allowing us to unpick this too. And the fascinating thing about this work with Rosa was that we did find latent variables in there, very similar to the great work done by Walk Free Foundation on the aspects of measuring countries. But one thing came out which hadn't been emphasized before was the physical security of women being a key indicator of risk. And again, it's the AI methods which are allowing us to emerge these new factors. Okay, given I've gone slightly over, I will rapidly hand back to Alice now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. I have to say we must have a slightly psychic audience because somebody wrote in with a question on how climate affects modern slavery. And we're about to pass it over to Doreen Boyd. Doreen is working on several areas and countries on the use of geospatial technology to identify sites of exploitation. And these may have environmental and climate factors. Doreen, can you describe some of the projects you're taking forward in this area?
Absolutely, thank you, Alice. I do have some slides. I'll just wait for those to pop up. That's great. Thank you very much for that. Good day, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about what we've been doing in the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, who work very closely with Jane Goulden's NLab. and the work we're doing around AI for good in the modern slavery space. If I can, I'll start with a little bit of background to the lab. We are home to the world's leading modern slavery experts and have built a large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery. So we're very much about exploring the novel approaches and trying things out in the modern slavery space. So we're organised across 5 research programmes, and one of them is focused on data and measurement. How can we improve data and measurement of modern slavery? What do we need to focus on to make this work better for the anti-slavery movement? So what we're about is delivering new and cutting-edge research that provides rigorous data, evidence and discoveries for that effort. So as you can imagine, you know, the multitude of opportunity provided by AI is something that we are very interested in. And therefore we need to explore exactly what artificial intelligence can do for us. Does it afford quicker and more accurate execution of our research tasks? Does it improve the output from those tasks and or the application and take up of our findings by the wider anti-slavery community? Because of course, this is what the research is for, to make a difference to those who are currently enslaved, but also to those who will be or are vulnerable to entering exploitative practices. So what we do in the data measurement program is we realize that having the right data and the approach to data capture and their analysis is extremely important, as is the dissemination of the output of that process. Now, this is extremely challenging, of course, because of the often hidden nature of modern slavery. We often can't measure the problem directly. And so, as we've already seen, we might need to use data proxies and different ways of capturing data so that we can retrieve actionable intelligence from these proxies. And of course, artificial intelligence, in particular narrow AI, is one way in which that effort can be assisted. So the one set of proxy data that I'm particularly interested in, given that I've used these data for many years, but for different sorts of applications, is that being captured constantly by the Earth observation satellites that are orbiting our Earth right now, and also have been orbiting right back for nearly 50 years now. So we are firmly in the era of what's called geospatial AI. And in the Rights Lab, we've been exploring that intersection between geospatial AI and the SDG Target 8.7. There are many attributes of Earth observation that make it attractive to use for our task. And we're really thinking about how artificial intelligence can help us extract the required intelligence from Earth observation data. So our big question is, how does one combine the advances in technology and data science optimally in the SDG Target 8.7 space? So if I may, I'll just spend a little bit of time overviewing some of the projects that we've been doing over the past few years that uses Earth observation data to look at modern slavery. And then I'll finish off with some comment on what we've learned so far and how we can move on from what we've done. So the first example that I have on the slide relates to a publication just come out in the journal Maritime Studies. And that used what we call very high resolution Earth observation data, such as from Digital Globe, the WorldView data, and then from Airbus, the Spot and Pleiades data. And as I say, these are being captured all of the time. And what we did here was to map the location and ascertain the impact of fish processing in the Bangladesh's Sundarban mangrove forest. And these are a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So they should be absolutely protected with very little human activity being undertaken. We know from ground intelligence that there have been human activities around fish processing camps which use forced labour. So what we did was to use the fact that we have an archive of data on these this area and indeed globally to try and map whether there were any fish processing camps and also you know, their evolution through time. And so what we were doing is taking the previous studies that had identified cases of labour exploitation and modern slavery occurring in this area. And we were using the EO data to triangulate these claims by providing spatial and temporal analysis to increase the understanding of the operational trends in the camps at these locations. And what we saw was that we can link our findings to the cyclical relationship between modern slavery and environmental degradation, where environmental damage is both a driver and a result of workers subjected to modern slavery. And of course, if you overlay then climate change onto that cyclical relationship, then you can imagine how that's going to go. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another example where we've used very high resolution EO data focuses on the exploitation of migrant workers who are picking strawberries in the Neo-Manalada area of Greece. And again, it's working with ground intelligence. So we work with local NGOs and we use the EO data to feed a multi-criteria decision analysis model to map the likelihood of occupants of the identified migrant camps that we mapped from EO data to being exploited. And we interviewed those migrant workers as well. And this basically has allowed us to provide information to the Greek Special Rapporteur on trafficking in human beings. And all of this data now and the modelling is included in an action plan of Greece's response to prevent exploitation going forward. They're very simple ways of using Earth observation data, but again, we can start to think about how we might integrate the techniques offered by the AI community in perhaps automating this mapping of the migrant camps and to provide a data stream into those who want that particular information. Next slide, please. We've also done work on the cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we're working with Siddharth Kara, again, using that ground intelligence that we get, in this case from Siddharth. And he's documented the exploitative use of children in the artisanal mines. And what he's noticed is that children are used for tunneling and to find the cobalt seams. So we know that that happens here and there, but we don't know the scale of the tunneling and therefore the exploitation that has maybe going on in the area. So again, here we've used very high resolution EO data and we've used support vector machine learning classification method to map the tunnels. But what we've also done is use a different type of Earth observation data called interferometric SAR. And that allows us to look at whether the ground is moving around these tunnels. And what we're trying to do is connect that ground intelligence to, is the ground collapsing? And we can see that to millimeter precision. And that tells us how many active tunnels are being worked in the area as well. And so two types of EO data being used. So, we can see the importance of data fusion in this particular example. A final case study, next slide, please, focuses on the Bull Trench brick kilns across an area called the South Asian Brick Belt. And for years, again, the ground intelligence have told us that these kilns tend to use bonded labour, but again, the scale of the problem was unknown. So put simply, nobody knew how many kilns there were across this area and how they came and go year on year. So again, we use very high resolution EO data to map every kiln across the 1.5 million square kilometre area of the brick belt and when they were constructed. And again, we particularly benefited from artificial intelligence methods here, using a convolutional neural network for the object detection to map over 66,000 kilns. And then we use the EO archive that I spoke about that goes back nearly 50 years from the Landsat satellite with random forest method to establish when the kilns were built and use that information to understand what drives exploitation risk. Next slide, please. So in all of these case studies, they've contributed to an ongoing learning of how we might use Earth observation data with AI in the endeavour to examine modern slavery. And so I'll stop with, noting three things from the work we've done so far in the lab. The first is at this stage, knowing what to label in the Earth observation data for any algorithm, AI or driven or not, is still very much in its infancy. So we still require that ground intelligence to tell us what we need to extract from the Earth observation data. So any local knowledge of what's going on is really crucial. So the case in point, we're just coming to the end of a project called the ASTER project, and that's funded by the International Partnership Programme of the UK Space Agency, where we're discovering what would be need to build what we're calling a modern anti-trafficking support system underpinned by Earth observation. And the focus country there is Uganda. And so discussions with NGOs and government have afforded a really deep dive into the cases of trafficking in persons in country. And now we have a good understanding of how a Earth observation could be used in such a system and what we would require of artificial intelligence to build such a system. And it's those partnerships that are really, really important. The second point I'd like to raise is that what's been readily apparent from the features or objects that we've extracted from Earth observation data is that those features and objects are always there in the Earth observation data. You know, the data is just telling you about the signal that comes back from Earth, come to the satellite, but they're not mapped by authoritative mapping agencies and so on, because the significance of those objects are not realised. We didn't realise brick kilns, that were, again, have always been in the data, were important if we were going to understand bonded labour, for example. And by studying these objects, what we've realised is that they have a significance for other sustainable development goals, not just for SDG number 8. So the brick kilns we've been mapping actually for India now underpin a Geo AI app developed by the United Nations Development Programme India Accelerator Lab to look at environmental issues with the kiln. So the environmental inspectors use the Geo AI app with the underpinning mapping to know where they're visiting, and in particular to look at the uptake of technology to improve the air pollution from the kilns. So what we see is an intersection between SDG 8 with SDG 13 and 15. And my final point is that our work has very much benefited from AI, but we're still understanding what EO data can offer us in our work. And of course, EO technology is always moving and it always innovates. And so we need to be keeping up with, again, what the potential for EO is. But part of this is, of course, driven by the innovative analytical methods offered by artificial intelligence. And therefore, we are very much of the opinion that advances in artificial intelligence should promote more opportunities to use that EO for SDG Target 8.7. But on this, we shouldn't be starting from scratch. We should always look to build on the learnings and initiatives already in place. And good examples of that include the planetary calculator by Microsoft AI for Earth, or the Big Earth project, which is looking at content-based image retrieval. So there's lots to be gained from working outside our sort of disciplinary silos and working in partnerships right across the board. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. We've received a lot of really fantastic questions from the audience. And I'd like to start with one that I think is particularly important. It was directed to Nadia first, but I think it's something you can all speak to, which is about the inclusion of survivors and people from affected communities in the development of AI tech and of these research agendas and of your work, and maybe even going into it on the ground and local partnerships and how that's worked. So if it's okay, maybe we could start with Nadia to speak a little bit about that, and then turn to the rest of you to talk about how you partner with survivors. I will note as well that survivor leadership has been instrumental to the development of Code 8.7 and participation in the Code 8.7 organizing committee.
Sure, thank you so much. So a couple of things I want to mention, two different sort of types of answers. One is there's a number of organizations that are participating in Code 8.7. A really good example of one is Annie Cannons. And Annie Cannons actually creates a boot camp that trains survivors with all kinds of skills, including technical skills. And I believe, Alice, they're actually working with the UN University on visualization technology. So that's a really good organization that's partnered through Code 8.7 that connects to a lot of this. Another one is Survivor Alliance. And then another dimension that I'll bring up is, and I think this also touches a little bit on another question that I saw in the session, is at ASU, we have Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research that is led by Professor Dominic Rose-Sepowitz. And that's another area where there are sort of very close relationships between the researchers and survivors or at-risk populations.
So I'll add to that with, one of the projects that I touched on is our work on participatory AI for tackling sexual exploitation online. And the whole participatory approach is not only the multi-sector stakeholder and the multidisciplinary research team, but having the domain experts that are both within the academic sector, but also across our sectors that have relationships with survivors and sex workers in this particular case. So it's engaging with them, doing focus groups, and they participate in a couple of different ways, or have the potential to participate in a couple of different ways. One is they help to inform actually the research by means of in their through their lived experiences of informing us about what the features are that we might need to look at, that we might not otherwise think of. But the other bit is to actually, in doing so, is taking their concerns around privacy and other concerns that they may have about how the data is being used and how the algorithms are going to be used. So it's really taking all of that into account in the co-design and development of it and the deployment. But these are, I would say that they're often a case-by-case basis in terms of each project, in terms of how survivors are engaged, but there certainly is opportunity for them to be.
Sorry, do you want to go, Dora?
Yeah, no, go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, like, I'd echo that for us, survivors have been absolutely key. So I don't think we can build AI models without survivors. So we work a lot with Mindang and the Survivor Alliance in our work, and I'm very lucky to be part of the Rights Lab as well, which has a huge connection with survivor programs and groups. And the reason why it's so essential is when we build an AI model, most AI models are what's called supervised machine learning, where you need ground truth. And to get those ground truths, something I never expected as an AI researcher, in an area like Dar es Salaam, I had to implement a huge survey to try and get those ground truths. So one, I know nothing about surveys. 2, I'd never really been to Africa before, and 3, it was completely out of my comfort zone. So you can only do that by working with other people. And it's not just expert social scientists who are going to be listing that information, but when you ask a survey about a sensitive issue like slavery, I mean, you can't just be bumbling in as some sort of colonial researcher and thinking you have like any right to do it, but 2, you're going to be able to ask the right questions. So for us, we went through a hugely extensive process of data collection, of which survivor voices were essential. So how do we ask the questions which elicit information about an area? How do we do it? How do we do it in a way not that it's sensitive, but also obtains accurate information? How do different forms of slavery generate features we might see when we're thinking about the features that go into our model? So without that conversation, essentially, you just have a load of computer scientists who are clicking buttons, and it's like every other machine. If you put junk in, you'll just get junk out. So that conversation for us was key in generating accurate ground truth.
Thanks, James. You've mentioned the Survivor Alliance, which is what I was going to mention. So thank you for that. But also I wanted to mention how, from a sort of EO perspective, okay, we're looking down from space and looking at the Earth, how it's really important to be working with, say, non-governmental organizations that have those survivor stories that can inform the work that we're doing. So we can then start to build up the data points. And my sort of vision for AI is that it might be able to tell us with fewer and fewer survivor narratives what we need to be looking for. And that's kind of a challenge, if you like, for the AI community. I'm not an AI scientist, I'm an Earth observation scientist, but can absolutely see the value of AI, but can we get to a point where we don't need lots of survivor narratives and that perspective to extract the most from the different data sources that we can be using, and then transfer those models and learning over space and time. That's my vision. And in terms of the project, the ASTERS project that I mentioned, we got to a point where we realized how the Earth observation data that we see, say, in Google Earth is democratic data to some extent now. Anyone can look at Google Earth, and we realizing how the contextual information that you can extract just by looking at Google Earth imagery could be so powerful. So you don't actually need to be an expert in Earth observation at all. But if you know what you're looking at, and if you could have survivors inform us about the journey they may well have been taken through the eyes of the imagery, again, that would be really powerful.
Could I just add there as well, just something I came to this field about 3-4 years ago, having looked at other SDGs, but just the notion that survivors aren't just like it, we're not like tipping our hat to it. They're like valuable members of the research team in the sense they are researchers with us. It's not like they should be doing this stuff for free as some sort of obligation. It's like, they are paid members of our research team because they're a valuable input into it. And that's just something that I think maybe goes underemphasized sometimes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very important to note. I would say, let me just classify the next group of questions is really about the data itself. So, there's access to different sources of data, and I've seen some questions around the kind of data. So working with open source data versus proprietary or fee-based data, how do you grapple with that? What do you have access to? And how does that work in developing AI? Doreen, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start before the dogs start barking again. Sorry. Yes, absolutely. We've been working with Turing around from an Earth observation perspective, what can we extract from open source data versus the data that you have to pay a lot of money for. So that's interesting in itself, because some of the qualities of the open data perhaps aren't as attractive to use as the proprietary data. However, there are initiatives out there that are opening up the data now, and we just need to keep an eye on those initiatives, but also be pushing for the initiatives around the SDG Target 8.7 space. So one of the examples is from Planet, who have opened up their data right across the tropics, more from an environmental science perspective. And it's the Norwegian government that has paid for that. But just keeping your eye on that, you realise, well, that's open data for anyone to use, so we can use it in the space of SDG Target 8.7. So that's something we're looking at now. And the other thing we've done is build partnerships with data providers. And I think probably James would want to pick up on this point in terms of the amount of effort that's going into building those partnerships really does pay dividends. But if we can try and reduce some of those barriers and that effort, I think, again, that would really push us forward in what we can do in this space.
So yeah, maybe I can usefully pick up on that. So I think it's a great question. So when we look at national level, all the data we do in our modeling there is open data. So it's stuff you can find reference in papers, it's on the web, national statistics, and a range of variables from, presence of democracy in countries to migration and so on. When you go down to smaller level areas, which I'm really passionate about local levels, neighborhoods, communities, rather than national figures, because you get national figures and they're great to look at, but I'm not sure they actually invoke change in practice on the ground. But when you start looking at areas of city and that sort of scale, then there are less open data sets to look at. There are some, they go in, but the real value is there in proprietary data sets. So the data that is stored about us, that exists, but just isn't being used for aspects of social good at the moment. And one of the key areas there, I think, that I'm always passionate about is the potential of cell tower data, which can be completely anonymized. You haven't got a clue. There's 10,000 people being served by the cell tower, but it gives you indications of, just overcrowding. And it fascinated the first time I worked in Tanzania that government statistics didn't reflect the sort of things you can see in those data sets. Just in villages have grown and there's rapid urban change, and it's too expensive and logistically challenges for some regions to keep track of all that data, but it isn't there. And if you can release it in, and I think it's opportunity here, because we're covered by GDPR, so all the work we do very much has to be according with EU directives, and that gives us an opportunity to be very transparent, because you don't need to go near any of those things when you're understanding vulnerability. Now, actually getting companies to work with you can be a challenge sometimes. They're not focused on it, but gradually I think that's shifting. So I think there's a consciousness now in many developing regions of large companies giving back to the communities that are providing them with, the money that powers their services. So especially in Dar es Salaam, it was a very much team effort between local community, universities, and this collaboration with a telco to better understand the areas. So it's something we're passionate about, growing that essentially corporate social responsibility, doing a very transparent and privacy preserving fashion, but also, it's just part of the process of companies should be releasing data back to the people who generated it anyway.
I was just going to pick up on Doreen and James' points too, and bring to light again what we've seen in two sort of different workshops that we've held. Initial one a couple of years ago, which James and Doreen were at, and one of the key things that came out was this whole challenge around data sharing, and again, with the UK's Policy and Evidence Centre for Modern Slavery and Human Rights, that was again the main thing that came out from the consultation. And I think one thing to think about too is, what are we looking to open up data for? Is it for research purposes versus if it's for other sort of government or private sector or the nonprofit sector too, recognizing that the nonprofit, the NGOs, are also collecting data and wanting to make use of these new technologies to support the survivors that they engage with and are supporting in the recovery side of things. And that's where we're really getting at, how do we enable these data flows in a way that isn't requiring constant data sharing agreements and constant negotiations, but developing sort of the best practices around that. And that is a lot of that is stemmed in trust and relationships, but also issues around privacy and security, of which I'm sure Nadia can also speak to. And so, you know, I'd sort of showed about how we're looking at how we can enable those data flows at different levels, understanding, you know, is it sensitive data, is it proprietary data, and to what extent then can we open that up, and what are the ways to open it up that is then made available for actually tackling these challenges. I'll leave it there and let Nadia pick things up.
So I was actually going to talk a little bit about this notion of, you know, so we're talking about AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like support vector machines and visualization. But sometimes, for example, in some of the work that ASU has done with police departments on sex trafficking, you know, you're talking about different file formats between a Phoenix police department and a Las Vegas police department, and then different file sharing agreements if you're looking at between state lines, for example. So this notion, and Anjali brought that up as well, this notion of understanding what is this data being used for, and where do you inject research, and where it is basically sort of basic software engineering is another really important distinction in terms of working with all kinds of users of this technology. So I think that's really important to kind of highlight. Not everywhere is AI going to be an appropriate tool to use. And sometimes basic tech fixes can make a lot of things quite a bit more efficient and easier, given that proper security measures are in place.
Thank you. And picking up on one thing you were noting, that AI may not be the right tool for every context. You know, one thing that was asked by somebody, which I think is a really interesting question, is whether AI or data tools can be used to identify or tackle any of these different indicators under 8.7, not just in middle and lower income countries, but also in higher income countries, where it's much easier to disguise these forms of exploitation, one could argue, and which also serve frequently as recipient countries of human trafficking situations. So I'd be really interested in knowing whether you might speculate on how AI could be used in higher development countries.
I guess this is where, sort of following up from some of my previous comments, I think it's important to make a distinction where in that transition pipeline do we bring in the technology? Because one of the things, again, and I'm talking in terms of in context of sex trafficking in the United States specifically, again, a lot of the challenges that arise around technology are things like policies of data sharing, policies of being able to combine data sources across different streams, privacy and security and data restrictions issues between different ordinances. So if you're looking at a city level or state level or national level, policies of interactions between places like Department of Homeland Security and local police departments. So those have become policy things. And I think where we can come in as AI researchers is we can identify what is possible. So it is entirely possible right now to look at a significant network data set and pull out patterns, especially if you have some sense of certain signatures, like the type of wording people use in context of those situations. But then how do you bring in the right data sets to bear in the problem, and also make sure that that data doesn't get misused or those algorithms don't get misused, and they consider the proper domain context that's involved. So I'll pause here and hand it over to Doreen.
Thanks, Nadia. The whole sort of developed versus the global north, global south question is one that I grapple with all the time, and obviously patterns of modern slavery differ geographically. So we have to bring the tools to the particular problem that has a geography. And Nadia has mentioned the sexual exploitation, particularly that's that's fostered by the online world, the digital world that we live in. And there's lots of examples of how AI has been used there. But also, you know, to recognise that where the perpetrator or the victim doesn't necessarily mean that it's out of sight, out of mind. And obviously the supply chain aspect is really, really important here. And there's lots of work now looking at, well, how do we use AI to examine supply chains to alert those many industries and companies within that operate in a lengthy supply chain. I think there was a study by the US government that said around 155 goods from 77 countries are made with child or forced labor. And it's the length of the supply chain that's the issue there. And there's lots of examples of quite high profile technology companies being taken to court around using particular minerals and so on in the production of what they offer and sell. And this is where there's been a lot of work to use artificial intelligence to try and reduce those third party risks in a supply chain. But from an Earth observation perspective, the work we're doing in Greece just shows that it's not just a global south problem. We can use AI with Earth observation to keep monitoring what's going on and to track any changes in the landscape. And actually, that's what we need to be doing. Track those changes. Oh, there's a change here. We know it's an area of concern. What's driving that change? And what you want is the AI to be able to tell you where to focus your efforts, because this is a worldwide problem. Lots of factors involved. We can't be everywhere, all seeing at all times. So we need to use what technology and data science is available to us to tell us where to focus our efforts.
I just wondered as well, just to add to that, Anjali, so the sex trafficking projects looking at social media and adverts, are they in the US? Is that I mean, obviously the US, is that the sort of target, tracking like migration over? Just something that occurred to me, and so I thought I'd ask you myself.
Thanks, James. So actually we are currently focused on the UK. We're, with UK police forces, but also the adult service websites that are primarily focused towards the UK population. However, as Doreen pointed out and was going to say, is that you can have perpetrators in one country and victims in another, and the users and abusers, depending on how you want to define them, all over the world. Right. And it's also, part of the work is, as Nadia also pointed out, is, we're trying to make use of, say, natural language processing or image recognition, et cetera. And you don't, there's lots of also fake ads and fake sort of information there where you're sort of determining, are they actually where they say they are? There's all sorts of both technical challenges, but it goes back to, I think, Nadia's point and all of ours in many ways, is that we're dealing with a global challenge and problem. And so these relate to issues of data and policy challenges of how do you deal with a perpetrator sitting over there. So even if you've identified through your machine learning sort of methods and approaches that this is a network and this exists here, you've now identified potentially a perpetrator or a victim in other countries. And that goes beyond, I think, our role as the computer scientists, the statisticians, and really requires that, again, that multi-sector partnership to sort of say, okay, now how do we deal with that? But yeah, it's interesting, I think, having gotten involved in this work is recognizing that actually, while some of these social media platforms and websites are also global, there are ones that are more pertinent, obviously, to some countries.
Yeah, I mean, just like in the example I showed with two people in Kent who were gangmasters, but the people were coming from Lithuania. So the reason they were entering into that situation was because of the context of where they came from. So you've got that prevent and pursue, which have to be connected together in some way. So, yeah.
I mean, and I think a lot of what we're doing is trying to get that contextual information. We're trying to get better situational awareness, right? That is part of the aim of also bringing some of these data sources together, but also recognizing there is data poverty, right? So as we look at that global sort of north or south, but just more broadly, is that there are, in some instances, we'll have more information in a certain region. And so then what are those other proxies that we might be considering, other data sources that can help to inform that? And it will be different, but we are, we get, as we work in certain areas and contexts and typologies, we get to learn from that and then see how that works in another setting and learning the different patterns. And I
guess, sorry if I'm just going to keep talking, Alice, is why I think Code 8.7 is so important, because I'm an AI researcher, but so much in my community is like analyzing pictures of cats and dogs, or trying to work out how to play Go better, even better than we can already beat humans, and we're still researching Go. Whereas these incredible problems that are far more important, but to solve them is logistically hard, because we've got to connect together. We've got to bring the different disciplines, different sources, different countries, which is what I think Code 8.7 is such a good thing. So I would encourage anyone to join it.
Excellent. And I promise I didn't offer James any kind of bribery to say that.
Ended up in
I'm going to go to one last question if I can sneak it in, and I'm actually going to cheat and combine two questions, because I see both of them as being an opportunity for you to expand further on other users of the research who are in their own ways major implementers of anti-slavery work. One is industry and the other is law enforcement. So how do you see these techniques as being potential opportunities or potential risks for use in monitoring supply chains, especially right now when traditional methods for ensuring that supply chains are free of trafficking and child labor are more difficult to implement, but also for law enforcement? And do you see any concerns about that use as well? And I know that's a very simple question to end on.
I might take the law enforcement side, just because we've been working closely with our law enforcement colleagues, particularly in the UK, but also more globally as well. And so I think what we're looking at is, what are the responsible thresholds that we need to set? And that's, again, that sort of gets into that whole participatory kind of approach of not only what the law enforcement needs are, but also in terms of the victims and the survivors and people that we're aiming to actually protect and prevent future exploitation. So there is, this gets into, as researchers, where we publish our research, our methods, our technologies, there's often this concern around closed form tools and what that actually does. And so from our perspective as researchers, we want it to make it publicly available, that everybody can make use of it. However, there is the concern, of course, that the exploiters themselves will take hold of some of this technology. They'll learn how to better evade the new ways of pursuit from law enforcement or intelligence agencies. So there is this whole piece around, I think, open research and open algorithms, etc., and how do we also then protect it from potential risk or harm? And then maybe the other bit that you were alluding to, Alice, in your question, was actually around concerns around surveillance and mission creep. And of course, I think that's where our work and all of us, our colleagues here, have been trying to emphasize, is that engagement with the community, the survivors, the public, in terms of how best to develop and implement these technologies with that in mind, and how we can ensure that we're doing it in a safe and responsible way.
Would anyone else like to add any other comments to that?
I guess the one thing that I will just really to echo the points that Anjali made, there's this notion of trust that's really important in AI systems, and trust from a technical perspective, trust from the survivor and at-risk community perspective, trust from agencies that may be trying to mitigate and combat these challenges. And I think it's there's this whole area of trusted AI systems and understanding how to build and trust into AI systems. And then there's the trust element that's more in the transition of that technology. And I think that's really, really important to emphasize. I mean, when you're working with data that's this sensitive, the trust has to be inherent in the relationship, in the partnership, whether that partnership is with the survivor community or with law enforcement agencies. And I think that's something that Code 8.7 has been really good at amplifying, that relationship-based work.
Well, thank you so much. Doreen, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't have really anything to add to that, other than if we can use all of this work that we're doing and obviously bring others on board, then are we going to get to the point where we are preventing? And that's essentially where we want to get to. If the perpetrators are thinking twice about what they're doing because of that realization that we've cracked this, then what a great position to be in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm happy to let you have the final panelists say on that. So I just want to close by thanking all of you. Really, it's exciting for me to hear about this work. I don't get the chance to talk to you as much as I would like about the different projects you're taking forward. And it's really fantastic to hear about. We started by talking about what Target 8.7 seeks to accomplish. And you've all at various points have talked about the need for data about vulnerability and prevalence and effective measures. I think we all agree that these are needs that have only grown in the past year. We've talked about the fact that there are over 40 million people considered to be living in these forms of exploitation. And I don't want to put anybody off the work by saying that I think we can expect those numbers to have increased in the past year, unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic and its various short and long-term impacts. So, more than ever before, I think the pandemic has exposed fragilities or potential fragilities in anti-slavery work, including in researchers' abilities to develop the evidence base. So, having heard our panelists identify key challenges and opportunities, as well as real progress in the use of computational science to identify novel data streams, I really look forward to seeing more Code 8.7 work grow. I know that some of you in the audience who very thoughtfully sent in questions didn't get a chance to hear your questions answered. And so I just want to close by noting that Code 8.7 is opening membership at no cost to organizations, whether you work on AI, computational science, and machine learning, and are interested in applying that research to achieving Target 8.7, or if you're an anti-trafficking, forced and child labor worker who wants to learn more about how these new techniques can enhance your research, please get in touch with us. There's more information available on the event webpage. So I just want to close again by thanking all of you today, our panelists, of course, and really especially the audience for your questions and comments and engagement with this topic. So thank you all, and I hope wherever you are, the rest of your day is great and that we can stay in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was a great discussion. A big thanks to our panelists and also all the participants for making it so engaging. You can also find more information as well as background material on aiforgood.itu.int. With that, we have reached the end of the webinar, and I would once again like to thank everyone involved, our panel, our participants, partners, sponsors, and co-conveners Switzerland.